Any of you ever, is there anybody who's not been to a weird weekend before? My God, I don't actually have to introduce you to Richard Freeman, who, because it's a weird weekend, Richard, a dear friend and colleague of many years, introduces the speakers in his own inimitable style.
Thank you. Oliver Lewis has been conducting a 5-year study of the grain silos of Eastern Europe, and the upshot of his research is tonight's talk, which he has, I think, quite cleverly entitled The Tiresome Brownie. And I've been there, and believe you me, that brownie was quite tiresome. Take it away, Ol.
The Kraken is probably the most unusual and some would say improbable sea monster ever said to exist. It was a creature of immense size that featured in many seafaring tales from Europe and the Arab world, and it was so large that it was often mistaken for an island. One of the most well-known descriptions of the Kraken was that of Jacob Wallenberg, who described the creature in modest terms as being no larger than the width of the Swedish island of Åland. Because Åland is 16 kilometres wide, this is perhaps not the best size description he could have given for an animal, particularly due to the fact that no single animal could ever become that big. Like most folklore, the first tales of creatures like the Kraken or the island beast probably date back to long before they were committed to print, but one of the first times they are recorded is found in the Physiologist, a bestiary from the 2nd century AD. An English translation of the Physiologist reads as follows. This time I will with poetic art rehearse, by means of words and wit, a poem about a kind of fish, the great sea monster that is often unwillingly met, terrible and cruel-hearted to seafarers, yea, to every man. This swimmer of the ocean streams is known as the asp turtle. His appearance is like that of a rough boulder, as if it were tossing by the shore a great ocean reed bank begrit with sand dunes, so that seamen imagine they are gazing upon an island, and moor their high-prowed ships with cables to that false land, make fast the ocean courses at the sea's end, and, bold of heart, climb upon that island, the vessels stand by the beach, enringed by the flood. The weary... Hello? The weary-hearted sailors then encamp, dreaming not of peril. On the island they start a fire and kindle a mounting flame. The dispirited heroes, eager for repose, are flushed with joy. Now, when the cunning plotter feels the seamen are firmly established upon him and have settled down to enjoy the weather, the guest of the ocean sinks without warning into the salt wave with his prey and makes for the bottom, thus whelming ships and men in that abode of death. Now, in most English translations of Physiologist, the beast is referred to as an asp turtle. Although in later translations, particularly those of Philippe de Thorn in the 12th century, the beast is referred to as a cetus or whale. But Kraken have had many identities claimed for them over the years. In the early 6th century, St. Brendan is said to have had a close encounter with the Kraken. He crossed the sea with a small crew of fellow monks, and they came across a strange-looking island. It was round, with apparently no rocks, grass, or sand upon it. As they had chanced upon the island just in time for Easter, the monks looked upon the find of the island as a blessing and decided to hold their Easter prayers and festivities upon it. St. Brendan, however, refused to take part and remained on the ship, having received advice from God on the matter. Hello? Oh, it's working again. The other monks probably made for the island, muttering about what a grumpy sod Brendan was, and they celebrated Mass on the island before they lit a fire in order to cook up the first meat they could have had after the abstinence of Lent. Unluckily for the monks, though, the island started to sink before the meat was even cooked. Fearing for their lives, the monks abandoned the fire and ran. They swam for the boat where Brendan held them aboard as the island sunk beneath the waves. When the monks had calmed down, Brendan said, "That was not an island on which you have celebrated Easter, but on a beast, the first and last and greatest of those that live in the sea. So wished our Lord to enhance our faith, for the more marvels we witness, the more we believe in him. And know this great beast is called Jasconius." From the origins of times, it has been trying to put its tail in its mouth, but is so enormous that it never succeeds. In this, it symbolises for us eternity. Now, Brendan's description of Jasconicus sounds more like the great serpent Jormungandr from Norse mythology than that of a turtle or whale. All of this illustrates just how much disagreement there is about the possible biological identity of the kraken. The main problem is, although this is often touted as a solved mystery, no one animal seems to quite fit the bill. As I mentioned earlier, the kraken, or island beast, was known as the ass turtle in the earliest recorded reports, and on the face of it, a turtle would seem quite a plausible theory to explain an island beast. However, there's a small problem with this theory. The largest living species of sea turtle is the leatherback turtle. And the largest leatherback ever was found washed up on Harlech Beach in Wales in 1988. And the stuffed body and bones are displayed in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. That's Wales the country, not Wales as in Wales, the animal. And this turtle is just under 3 metres long, which is far too small for a mariner to have tethered any boat larger than a dinghy to, and certainly too small to accommodate a crew of men. It is possible, indeed quite likely, that there are a few individual turtles that have grown slightly larger than the Harlech turtle, but they are unlikely to be capable of growing to much larger sizes. The most popular theory about the kraken today is that they are giant squid. Indeed, most drawings and paintings you see of the kraken are that of some huge cephalopod with a ship clasped in its tentacles, drawing it to its doom. And if books and films like Pirates of the Caribbean and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea's depictions of giant squid are anywhere near close to the truth, then it certainly doesn't take much imagination to name the giant squid as the kraken of legend. Now, sadly, you really shouldn't believe everything you see in a film or read in a novel. There are a lot of myths about the abilities and ferocity of giant squid that have sprung up over the years because of the elusiveness of the creatures, that have, despite being untrue or misconceptions, found their way to the page or screen in order to imperil the protagonist. Now, until very recently, giant squid had never even been observed alive in their natural habitat of the deep ocean. And all that was known about them was based upon dead specimens that washed up on beaches and postulation based on other species of squid and evidence of their interaction with other animals. Now, indeed, there's still quite a lot unknown about giant squid. So much so there's still debate about how many species of giant squid there are, with some people arguing there's only one species, Architeuthis dux, and others arguing the case for as many as 8. Now, the sizes giant squid can reach are large, but not quite as large as people might expect, and are often hugely exaggerated. Scientists estimate that the mantle of the giant squid reaches a maximum size of about 2¼ metres or 7 foot 4 inches, and that's a foot and a couple of inches taller than me, to put it into perspective, as you will see from this fantastic diagram. And a very accurate depiction indeed.
Of you or the squid?
Now, when the head and arms of the squid are added to the length of the mantle, this reaches a maximum length of about 5 metres or 16 foot, which is about the height of a double-decker bus. And the vast majority of the creature's length comes from the 2 long feeding tentacles, The maximum length of the giant squid, including the tentacles, is thought to reach approximately 13 metres or 43 foot for females, and 10 metres for males, or indeed 33 foot, meaning that a fully grown female is as long as a 12-metre double-decker bus. Now, there have been reports of much larger giant squid. However, these are due to either the feeding tentacles of the squid being stretched after death or just inaccurate reporting. For example, what is often said to have been the largest giant squid ever discovered washed ashore in a place called Thimbletickle, Notre Dame Bay, Newfoundland. Most sources quote the length of the Thimbletickle squid at a whopping 16.5 metres or 55 foot, and that's 3 metres longer than what is meant to be the maximum size a female can grow to. Not wanting to miss a trick, and seeing the tourist potential of being the place where the largest giant squid was discovered, local officials commissioned a life-size sculpture of the squid. And you can see it up on the screen now, and it's a rather impressive looking sculpture. There is, however, one problem with it. It's the wrong size. The sculpture's 55 foot alright, but unfortunately the squid was nowhere near 55 foot. I've looked at the original handwritten source of the report, and in it the length of the squid is actually written as 35 foot, which is well within normal size range for a female. The error apparently came from someone transcribing the source incorrectly and mistaking a 3 for a 5, and ever since then people have optimistically quoted the typo. Now, it's a shame that whoever commissioned the sculpture didn't check the original source too. Then they wouldn't have spent a large amount of money on an oversized statue to commemorate a spelling mistake. Another problem is that because the feeding tentacles of the squid are so rarely intact when dead specimens wash up on beaches, should a giant squid be preserved, photographed or drawn, the long tentacles that make over half the cephalopod's length are often no longer present. And this leads people who are unaware of this to assume that the squids measure 13 metres from the tip of the mantle to the end of the feet, which also leads people to vastly overestimate how large the squid's mantle is. It's highly unlikely that a giant squid, although a most fascinating animal, could be responsible for the Kraken myth. In the rare event that one swam up to the surface from the deep ocean to lollop on top of the waves, the creature's mantle, which would be the only part of the squid's body a man could even hope to step on, would certainly be too small to moor a ship to, let alone support the weight of several seamen at once and a fire. Now, before giant squid were widely known about, the preferred candidate for the identity of the Kraken was, more often than not, a large whale. For example, in the middle of the 13th century, Richard de Formeville described the island beast as a whale in his book, the Bestiaire d'Armor. They came to a kind of whale which was so large that it holds its back above the water, and sailors believe that it is an island because its hide is everywhere, like the sands of the sea. And the mariners tie up to it as if it really was an island, and stay there for 8 days or 15 and cook their meats on the whale's back. And when it feels the fire, it dives with all aboard to the bottom of the sea. This is far from the only time whales are mentioned in connection with the island beast. As I've said before, some translations of the Physiologus refer to the asp turtle as a whale, and the encounter St. Brendan had in the 6th century, which I mentioned earlier, is also often depicted in artistic impressions as that of a whale or a large fish. Of course, this is completely at odds with how Brendan described the island beast, but it seems that whales are easier to draw than gigantic sea serpents, and in an age when many people were illiterate, these pictures were the only way most people came to know the story. In fact, so great was the association with St. Brendan, the Kraken, and Kraken with Wales, that the Vatican actually made St. Brendan the patron saint of Wales. Again, this is quite opposite to before, because that's actually the animal, not the country. Another saintly encounter with a whale was attributed to St. Malo, who was a disciple of St. Brendan, and according to some accounts, was one of the monks who had set foot upon the Kraken while Brendan remained upon the boat. Mallow was at sea on a much larger ship than Brendan had for his voyage, housing a crew of almost 200 people, and was distressed at the fact that with no land in sight, he wouldn't be able to give the crew their Easter communion at the same time, or with the required pomp and ceremony aboard such a crowded ship. Mallow prayed about this and was surprised when he saw a new island emerge from beneath the waves right before his eyes. He quickly gathered up the crew, bread, wine, an altar, his Bible, and all the other things necessary for an ostentatious communion service, and made for the island. He and all the 180 crew he had communion on the island without mishap and returned to the ship, whereupon the island sank beneath the waves. The island in this case was claimed to have been a whale by some of the very first recorders of the tale. Large whales would, unlike squid or turtles, certainly be big enough to support the weight of several men. However, a whale, unless sick or dying, would not tolerate men standing on its back or boats being tied to it, anywhere near long enough for men to get a fire started. My own theory about the island beast is that most people have been looking to explain the Kraken have misunderstood what the Kraken is and have been looking in entirely the wrong place. For me, the penny dropped after reading the Kraken description given by Jacob Wallenberg. And if you remember, that was the Swede who gave the rather unhelpful size reference I mentioned at the start of the talk. He goes on to mention something that the Danish historian Erik Pontoppidan wrote about the Kraken in his 1752 book, The Natural History of Norway. According to legend, the fishing above a Kraken is phenomenally good, because fish swarm around the creature in huge numbers to feast upon the large quantities of waste it produces. And it is oftentimes said in Norway that when a fisherman comes back with a good catch, other fishermen will say they must have fished on the Kraken. Now this reminded me of times when I had gone sea fishing as a boy in the Bristol Channel off South Wales. Oh, I looked so cute then, didn't I? What went wrong? Ooh, thank you. The best spot for fishing was on a sandbank that was just below the water at low tide. And if you found the right spot in the sandbank, you could catch where the fish funneled through little passes in the sand that formed a sort of valley. Similarly, in the shallow waters above reefs, you're more likely to catch more fish too, because the fish population is much more concentrated in that area. So, where does the Kraken come into all this? Now, this is a graph showing the high and low tides in the Bristol Channel over one lunar month. There are two tides, roughly every 24-hour period, but to simplify things here, I've taken an average of the high and low tide marks for each day. You'll notice that the tides also cycle, and the tides with the lowest tidal range or throw are called the neap tides, and the tides with the largest throw is known as the spring tide. That would be a neap tide, and that would be a spring tide. These tides also cycle over the period of 12 lunar months. So once a year there will be one tide that has a greater flow than all the others. And that means that tide will be the highest tide of the year and also the lowest. At such low tides, sandbanks, reefs and rock outcrops that are submerged for most of the year can be exposed above the water for a while if the sea level drops low enough. How long and how often this temporary island is exposed by the sea depends on how high the island is above the lowest point of the tide. Islands like these are often responsible for phantom island myths. tales of islands that are marked on sea charts but oddly absent when a future mariner tries to find them. For example, if we look at the graph behind me of an island if an island was above the waves and charted at a low tide on a spring tide, on day 25 of this graph, for example, then it would only be 2 meters higher than the low tide. And it would be completely submerged at low tide if a mariner was searching for it during a neap tide around day 4 of this graph, for example. And when landing on such an island, there may be just long enough to tie up your boat and try to light a fire, or if you're really lucky, there might be time to conduct an ostentatious communion service before the tide comes in. Now, 2 of the stories of the Kraken encounters I've read out today are claimed to have involved the same man, St. Malo. This picture becomes even more interesting when you consider that during his second encounter with the supposed island beast, he was travelling in the same part of the sea as he had on the voyage of St. Brendan several years previously, and crucially at the exact same time of the lunar year. I strongly suspect that Malo had worked all this out for himself, and that he knew the island was no great serpent. After all, Malo had set foot on the island all those years ago, and felt the firm stone beneath his toes. What Malo also knew was that the first time he had seen the island disappear beneath the waves, it had instilled a sense of wonderment in him and the other monks, which is just what you need if you're a saint trying to build up your reputation. Now, if we take away the spin from most, if not all, Kraken myths, then you're left with something that sounds very much like a phantom island. Because of the problems there are with many of the biological explanations of Kraken, I believe that Kraken are not living beings at all, but just phantom islands embellished to make a more entertaining traveller's tale. Thank you. Do we have a spare microphone, Dave?
Use that one.
Right, is there any questions? Okay, last question.
Oh, have you examined Kraken stories from outside of Northern Europe, like Pacific, South Atlantic, anywhere else in the world?
I haven't yet, but there doesn't appear to be too much traditional Kraken stories from outside of Europe and the Arab world, and that's what I'm actually focusing on, is the European and Arab tales, which are the oldest tales.
Okay, thanks.
I think your theory sounds very interesting and is probably the explanation for quite a lot of these stories. But have you considered the fact that the Kraken stories might be a mixture of several kinds of stories? You mentioned Bishop Pontoppidan and his stories, which are one of the classic stories about Krakens. There's a lot of stories in Scandinavia about Krakens actually specifying the fact that these Krakens have arms, lots of arms. So although I think you're right in that, I also think that stories about giant squids are actually involved in all of this. And There was a Danish scientist called Johannes Steenstrup, who in the early 18th centuries found out that stories about sea monks were in fact stories in his mind about giant squids. And at the time he found out that local people in Denmark, as well as in Sweden and various other places in Scandinavia for many, many centuries had actually known giant squids as Krakens. So I think there might be squids involved after all.
It's certainly a possibility, but in terms of actually getting a squid that was large enough to be the classical island beast style of kraken, then I'm not really sure you could get squids quite that large. But I think what's happened is that squids have actually become intertwined in the kraken myth, because they are basically large things at sea.
Yeah.
But as far as an island beast goes, even the giant squid would be too small to be an actual island.
Oh yeah, I quite agree.
Okay, down over.
If what you say is correct, you shouldn't see any difference at all in the Mediterranean, because the tidal range there is very, very small. But you've got the Roman Empire and so on in the area for a very long time. So people have been writing stories down for a long time. So in theory you should have people who are able to write stories down about Kraken, but you shouldn't get any at all. Is this what you observe?
Well, I've not really come across many kraken myths at all from the Mediterranean, and those which are retellings of other earlier ones, which are from around the coasts of Britain and Scandinavia and various other places. Because the Physiologist was actually first written in Greece, which was the first bestiary I quote from, and it's actually telling tales about kraken which were seen off the coast of Europe rather than in the Mediterranean itself.
Okay, do you hear me? I would strongly support the argument of the gentleman on the first bench down there, who, because I'm from Sweden myself, so I know that there's a vast quantity of Kraken lore from Sweden and particularly Denmark, from Pontoppidan and from Steenstrup, who I believe wrote a treatise on the subject. And these Scandinavian Krakens are all described as having tentacles, at least certainly most of them are, and not as islands coming and going. So there is clearly more than one thing going on here in my mind at least. Finally, a question. Didn't Lord Tennyson write a poem about Kraken?
Yes, he did, and I was actually considering starting my talk with that, but unfortunately, I've had several bard experiences with poetry.
Get him out of here.
Is that my cue to leave now?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, consider Mr. Entertainment. Mr. Oliver,